the Constitution was drafted before income tax in its modern form even existed, and so there is a lack of clarity, and the resulting grey areas meant that this argument never goes away.
God.
Or is it that grey? I think the founding fathers, born in the Enlightenment and great believers in liberty and
absolutely.
limited government, would not have liked income tax.
They would have never gone for this.
But they also wouldn't have liked the tariff system. But in any case, this was all put to bed in 1913 because you got the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. They just changed the Constitution. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration.
Oh, man.
And so that opened the door, opened the pathway to a much more heavily taxed nation, and therefore to big government.
God, that's so antithetical to everything the founding fathers believed in. They'd be rolling it over in their graves.
I'll say. Well, there was a case in 1895, Pollock versus the Farmers Loan and Trust Company. Famous case, and that the Supreme Court ruled that income tax was unconstitutional. But in any case, I think often there's just a tide in the affairs of men. But it's a classic case of, we keep saying this, the amounts payable are low at first. And they were.
Yeah.
And then the next point is the tax has all sorts of unintended consequences.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk'd. I'm here again with Dominic Frisby on our series about his book, Daylight Robbery. And today we're going to discuss my least favorite chapter in the book, The Birth of Big Government.
Everybody's least favorite subject, when government grew. So it's amazing to think that at the turn of the 20th century, most countries in the developed world had taxation levels around about 10% of GDP, which is a number that goes all the way back to the tithe. Britain, Sweden, I think, had the lowest. Sweden was like at about 5%. Everyone talks today about the wonderful Scandinavian model, but wasn't the case then. And Britain was the world's richest country. Amazing to think. We're a long way from that now. Yet 19 in 20 people didn't own any real estate. And so the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy landowners. And the ideas of Karl Marx that wealth should be spread were gaining traction, and this sort of socialist tide was spreading across Europe and the world. America had a strong enough natural culture to resist it. But the champions of this new tide in Britain were David Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor, and his young ally, Winston Churchill. And across Europe and America, there had been these things called the friendly societies. You had them in the States. Do you know what they are?
I vaguely know what they are, but it seems like the government has tried to take on that role of what they were trying to do, which is kind of like a little community-based. We have certain. I think there's you pay into these like insurance plans, and if you need it, you can use it, and it's kind of like a cooperative type of thing. My understanding, it's similar to that.
They were exactly that. They were little cooperative societies, and each area would have had one. And people paid their money into this cooperative society, and then the people who ran the society on behalf of the community would then, if somebody that everyone in the community knew broke his leg or something, then they would provide medical care for that person, or if he had a terrible accident, he lost his job, they would provide welfare for that person. And it was all locally run, and so people knew, they knew if that person was a genuinely nice person or if he was a bit of a, do you know what I mean? They sort of, the community looked after it. And there's ways of providing healthcare, welfare, and so on. And they were incredibly successful in Britain, and in fact, in the States as well. But the problem is they looked after everyone, but there was still that sort of bottom 3-4% that they didn't look after. And so the government, of course, took it upon themselves to find a system that would look after that bottom few percent, who it almost doesn't matter what you do. There always seems to be that bottom few percent that almost don't want looking after.
Yeah, no, you're completely right.
But in any case, and so Lloyd George and Churchill were intent on copying the friendly society. So they introduced over the course of a few years national insurance. Effectively, it was insurance money that you were paying to these cooperatives. But they introduced compulsory national insurance. And people couldn't afford to pay insurance twice because they would have to pay compulsory national insurance and then insurance into their local society. Yeah. So they only paid it once. And of course, they had to pay the one that was compulsory. Mm-hmm. And so in bringing in national insurance, they put the friendly societies out of business. And they had to do various shenanigans to get this National Insurance Act over the line, but eventually they got it over the line. And as I say, that was the impact. And this was 1911. And then we got the Great War. And that changed taxation and government.
They wouldn't raise taxes to fund a war, would they?
They really did. They really did. And we sort of stumbled into the Great War. But even with the National Insurance Act, income taxes didn't rocket. They were still quite low. It was about 3.5%, and it was only about 3 million people paying taxes, income tax, something like that. But even then, Lloyd George was considered quite profligate. J.P. Morgan said he has no thought for the final bill. But in any case, war came along. Sorry, it was about 1 million people were paying income tax at this point. Then the Great War came along, and the standard rate of income tax in the UK went from 6% to 30% by the end of the war. The amount of people paying income tax trebled. There were now over 3 million people. The total tax take went from 160 million to 800 million. So 17 times, and it was 17 times higher than it had been when before the national insurance came along at all. And yet, that total income tax only paid for about a fifth of the war spending. Just incredible. The national debt went from 650 million to 7.4 billion. And we only finished paying it off 100 years later in 2015. And debt was what paid for the most of the war, and currency debasement and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And we didn't actually, people think we came off the gold standard. I thought we did come off the gold standard to pay for the war. What we actually did is we did everything but come up off the gold standard. We removed gold in circulation and printed loads of paper, and we had a massive propaganda war to tell people not to hoard gold, to buy bonds and all the rest of it.
Well, they did debase, I believe, didn't they? They
massively.
They cut the value in half.
Yeah, and Germany and France both came off the gold standard.
Okay. Yeah.
And so effectively gold was removed from the monetary system.
Well, we saw what happened with Germany, the hyperinflation, the war bonds, all this
stuff.
So.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think I think it was 1913 or 1914, the US did a basically saying, hey, your dollar's worth half as much gold. I think that was what it was.
Yeah, that was 32. Roosevelt.
So we sold, so the financing of U.S. involvement in World War I was primarily done through selling Liberty bonds and other war bonds, increasing taxes and other fiscal measures, rather than directly manipulating the gold standard. Therefore, the link between the dollar and gold was not debased in 1913, 1914 for the purpose of financing the war. Okay, so I think you did hit the nail on the head. You were, we did everything but, debt.
You used debt. And Germany didn't have any income tax at all. America brought income tax in 1913. We'll come to that in a second.
Okay, yeah.
Germany didn't have income tax at all. So you could say that it was income tax made the difference between Germany relied on debt. We had debt and income tax. And so maybe it was income tax won the war. But it certainly enabled us to get that little bit more funding. Mm-hmm. Now, income tax came to America in 1913. And it was first proposed 1814 by your man Andrew Dallas, who gave us tariffs instead. He didn't get it over the line. Then we talked about it. Abraham Lincoln introduced it in 1861 to pay for the Civil War, and then got rid of it 1872 after the war was over. And the big argument in the States was whether income tax was constitutional or not. And the Constitution was drafted before income tax in its modern form even existed. And so there is a lack of clarity. And the resulting grey areas meant that this argument never goes away. God. Or is it that grey? I think the founding fathers, born in the Enlightenment and great believers in liberty and limited government, would not have liked income tax.
They would have never gone for this.
But they also wouldn't have liked the tariff system or the inequitable consequences. Anyway. And the thing that the Constitution does say is that taxes should be proportional. So a state with 1/10 of the population should bear 1/10 of the total liability. But the problem with that is you might have one state that's really rich, has hardly got any people, and another state that's very poor and has lots of people. And if it's done on a per capita basis, then that's not necessarily the fairest way to do it. But in any case, this was all put to bed in 1913 because you got the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. They just changed the Constitution. Yeah. And the new amendment is horrible, but it's the Congress shall have
how they
power.
got away with that.
Well, I guess they got rid of tariffs by this point because tariffs were a problem.
Wilson traded tariffs for this. I mean,
yeah. And but shall I read you that 16th Amendment? It's quite a good.
Read it out.
I should probably read it in an American accent.
I'll plug my ears. Just kidding.
Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration.
Oh man!
And so that opened the pathway to a much more heavily taxed nation, and therefore to big government.
God, that's so antithetical to everything the founding fathers believed in. They'd be rolling it over in their graves.
I'll say.
Paul, do me a favor, look it up. How did they get the 16th Amendment passed? I'm just curious because I think to amend the Constitution, you have to have an overwhelming majority, I believe. I think that's the way it's designed.
Well, there was a case in 1895, Pollock versus the Farmers Loan and Trust Company, famous case, and that the Supreme Court ruled that income tax was unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I think often there's just a tide in the affairs of men. Mm-hmm. And that's probably what went over the wire.
So they did, yeah. I guess it was. It looks like the proposal in Congress was a way to lower the tariffs, which were very high at the time. So it was kind of like a trade. And now most of us who are living in this Orwellian society today are like, "Fuck, we'll bring back the tariffs. We'll get rid of the income tax and bring back the tariffs."
But it's a classic case of we keep saying this. The amounts payable are low at first, and they were. Yeah, and then. The next point is the tax has all sorts of unintended consequences.
Look at this, 30. So you needed 3/4. That was a pretty high bar to clear. That's why it's very hard to amend the Constitution. So at the time, they got 36 out of the 48 states to ratify it. There was significant public support for the amendment, fueled by progressive era ideals of addressing economic inequality and the need for federal revenues to support new social programs and infrastructure.
Well, it was that Marxist tide that was gripping the world, and they knew the dangers of tariffs in a way that we've probably now forgotten, as history has been rewritten.
Seems that way.
But we talked about the unintended consequences of these new taxes, and what was the great unintended consequence of income tax? There are many, but there was one immediate one.
The great unintended consequence of income tax, the deduction, to be able to deduct at source.
Prohibition.
Oh, the prohibition. Oh, man.
Who would have thought income tax led to prohibition?
So I think about this. It's like there's these moments in history that are like the butterfly effect. And like this moment when I think the guy's name is Wayne Wheeler.
Yeah.
And you think about this thing and like he was a kid, I guess, and he got stabbed by a drunk.
Mm-hmm.
So like that one moment in history, and he just like, again, my personal testimony is I don't drink alcohol, I don't do drugs, I don't, you know what I mean? I saw the horrors of addiction in my own life, and I just chose not to do those things. It's not going to be a part of my life. It's not going to affect my life. I'm not going to, put my brain at risk and my future and my kids, et cetera, in the future at risk. I'm just going to avoid it.
Yeah, and your life is probably better for those decisions.
It's probably the best decision I've ever made in my life, honestly, because I have ADHD. I'm very active. I'm a risk taker. I have all these things, but that decision, I think, to stay away from substance abuse, probably the best decision I ever made in my life.
Imagine the risks you take.
Change the trajectory. Yeah, change the trajectory of my life. And it's funny you said that. They just did a recent study. They said they found out that people with ADHD live an average of like 8 to 10 years less than everybody else. And it's because they're very impulsive, more likely to have substance abuse problems, and they're extreme risk takers. So, put that combination together and you've got, a higher likelihood of early death from whatever it may be. But this moment in history, and I've always thought, let everybody decide what they want to do. You want to do psilocybin mushrooms? cool. You have PTSD and you need it, go for it. You know, you want to drink, sure, it's your life. You know, you want to do X, Y, or Z, personal accountability, personal responsibility. That's your decision, right? This guy, Wayne Wheeler, he took this other route where he just wanted to control everybody else and eliminate it for everybody else. And of course, what happened to him was horrible. But it just makes you think that you know, that one moment in history, that butterfly effect. He was stabbed in the leg by an alcoholic or by a drunk, and that impact had such far-reaching repercussions and tied it into the whole tax narrative of looking at history through taxes. Just fascinating.
It's incredible, particularly, you know, formative experiences when you're young. And sometimes when you're around kids, and, you know, I've brought up 4 of my own kids, you sort of they're just tiny little things to you. You dismiss them, but they're just huge events in a kid's life. And this one here, you know, he was accidentally stabbed. He grew up on a farm, and he was accidentally stabbed in the leg with a pitchfork by one of the workers on the farm who was drunk, and it gave him a lifelong hatred of alcohol, and it put him on a mission. And in 1893, he'd been listening to a sermon on temperance, and he joined this newly formed anti-Salon League, and he became, in many ways, that anti-Salon League became the most influential political pressure group the United States has probably ever seen. And in fact, the term pressure group came from him, and pressure politics is sometimes called Wheelerism. And the temperance movement had hundreds of thousands of people who believed in it, but the whole thing was disparate. It was diffused. There was no leadership. Like, for example, there was this women's Christian temperance union who was also campaigning for vegetarianism. And there was another group that was trying to influence the forest conservation. And what Wheeler did is he just made it stand for one thing and one thing alone. And he would just cycle from town to town, speaking at churches, recruiting supporters. He did telegram campaigns, demonstrations, and anyone who supported him on this one issue was an ally. And anyone who went against him was an enemy. And, you know, they could have been a mass murderer, but if they were against alcohol, they were an ally. Similarly, it could have been Jesus Christ. If he was pro-alcohol, he was an enemy. It was that simple, and he was that ruthless about it.
He's clever. He was very clever. I mean, he really. And again, the other context of this is that at the time, 40% of all the income came from taxing alcohol for the government. Right.
Yeah,
that's a big caveat here to think about. Is like the biggest hurdle for what he wanted to do was the fact that was like almost half of government revenue came from alcohol tax.
It did. And, but what he found is he was able, with this sort of friend or foe mentality, he was able to form all these alliances. And, you know, if there'd been a referendum in America on prohibition, there's no way that prohibition would have won. There is just no way.
Majority of people want freedom.
Yeah.
To do what they want to do.
But what he was able to do was apply pressure to politicians in swing states and marginal states. And often that issue was enough to just get an extra few votes to carry them over the line and win the seat. So he had disproportionate influence. And
he's the George Soros of today.
Yeah, and
Stalling
at one
all
point,
these activist judges,
exactly. And there was one thing in Ohio, and there was an early issue, and he managed to persuade half the legislature. Some were Democrats, some populist, some Republican, and he defeated all of them. And so he got this law over the line. And the governor, who was this chap called Myron T. Herrick, watered down his bill to make it more workable. And Wheeler just went absolutely nuts. And the Herrick had this very strong majority. He was the most popular. He had the largest majority in the state's history. He was well funded. He was popular. And Wheeler took him on, and by just he kind of smeared him a little bit, and he made out that he was he spread this document as the gubernatorial election approached. He spread this document that the Brewers had sent to Wheeler about quietly supporting Herrick quietly supporting him, and he managed to smear him and got this election. It was the largest turnout in Ohio history, and every Republican on the ticket was nominated except Herrick.
Oh, wow.
And so he just showed him what was possible, and he thought, if I can do this locally, he then did it at the national level. So he had these weird alliances where he would have evangelical clergy, industrial workers of the world, women. He was particularly keen on women because he felt that women were more likely to vote for dry candidates, urban progressives who were concerned about drunkenness, the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, man.
He had on his side, and then actual Jewish and Catholic and Irish and Italian organizations who the Ku Klux Klan didn't like. He got them on his side as well because, if they were anti-alcohol. And he just kept doing this. But the big issue, exactly as you said, is that something like 40% of federal revenue, government revenue, came from alcohol taxes. And there was no way that there was any, if they banned alcohol, those taxes would be lost. And therefore, how was the government going to fund itself? Then along came this new thing, income tax. And there was Wheeler's answer. And of everyone who campaigned for income tax, Wheeler was like one of its most forceful proponents. And lo and behold, he got it. World War I came along, and it was shown how much money could be raised through income tax. At the beginning of World War I, the amount of taxes were quite low. But by the end of World War I, I think, they in making alcohol income tax legal, they reduced tariffs from 40% to 26%. And but the World War I showed just how much money it was possible to make through income tax. Top earners by the end of World War I were paying 77% income tax. Extraordinary. And by the end of World War I, it was just normal. It had become normal to Americans. And so that's when he was able to finally get prohibition over the line after the war. There was this sort of, we've got to up our game sort of attitude pervaded a little bit. Mm-hmm. And he got it over the line in 1919. But of course, he might have got prohibition over the line, but he couldn't stop Americans drinking.
Of course not.
And so there was loophole after loophole. And if you wanted a drink, you could find it.
Mm-hmm. Like everything else. You know?
Yeah. And the problem was this had all sorts of unintended consequences. There was just organized crime had not existed to anything like the same level. Suddenly you got organized crime, bribery, corruption, the police, politics. It was right through the system. The penal system was overburdened. Loads of people lost their jobs. This culture of binge drinking was created. There was all sorts of health consequences. At least bad alcohol killed at least 50,000 people. But how many people died as a result of the new crime wave, as a result of the binge drinking, as a result of the violence?
It reminds me of the whole fentanyl situation now with people, going in these back alleys and getting these drugs and
I'm sure that if drugs were made legal,
there'd be less of that.
There would be. It wouldn't just be totally rosy, but you'd kill all the crime. Water would be dangerous if it was sold by criminals.
Yeah.
So how dangerous is drugs going to be?
Yeah. No doubt.
It would put. It would be more truthful. It would get this thing from out of the gutter and under the cover out in the open. You'd be in a better position to treat addicts.
Absolutely.
You could tax drugs. Imagine what you could
do
with the revenue from those drugs. The drugs that people would be taking would be better and cleaner, and therefore, if they're better quality and cleaner and not so damaging, what is the problem? Many drugs aren't as damaging as alcohol itself. And,
I agree.
And alcohol's been part of our culture for thousands of years, and so have drugs. People have been taking magic mushrooms and smoking weed since
the concept
forever.
Of, again, I just think about the world differently. But when you grow up and you kind of like see what's happening, when you become an adult, you look around and you say, "Why the fuck am I paying taxes to keep people in cages for years because they decided that they wanted to take drugs themselves?" It just blows my mind that that's
I don't see how people can be in prison for smoking, dealing weed.
I don't understand it either. It just doesn't make sense to me.
It's such a waste of money.
This is coming from somebody who's like like Wayne Wheeler in a lot of ways. Like, I don't personally do that myself, and I personally despise it. Like, that's how I think about it. I don't like it. You know what I mean? I think it's terrible for people. But like to force what I think on everybody else, it makes me sick.
But here's the thing. They couldn't, once prohibition was there, they were so scared of and they could see what an awful situation they were in. They were so scared of Wheeler and the anti-prohibition lobby that they just let it remain. And I find this really, really interesting, that in 1932, you've got the election Roosevelt against Hoover, one of the most famous elections in American history. And we're told that Hoover lost because of the Great Depression, because of the stock market crash, because of Roosevelt's New Deal. Well, is that really the reason? The Hoover campaign, Roosevelt, one of the ways he was going to pay for his New Deal and remonetize America, refund America, was by making alcohol legal again and taking the tax and using the money to pay for his New Deal. And by this point, Wheeler had died. He died in 1927. And that was one of the pledges on which Roosevelt got elected. Now, the Hoover campaign conducted a poll in 1932, which they did some research, and it's only recently been uncovered. And it shows that at the time, Americans did not blame the government for the Great Depression. They did not blame Hoover for the stock market crash or any of those things. They did not hold him responsible. And the biggest issue of the day for most Americans was prohibition. And Hoover defended it, and Roosevelt went against it. And that is what Roosevelt offered, the repeal of prohibition. And that's what won Roosevelt the presidency.
I think that's a good stopping point.